So today's topic is facilitating collaborative groups, exploring career pathways for facilitators, successes and lessons. And Laura Calandrella, I'm so excited that Laura has agreed to speak with us today and share her experiences. So thank you so much. So let's dive in. This is such a great afternoon to be doing this. Let me tell you a little bit about Laura. For those of you who don't know her and aren't groupies yet, with her book right on the front of your desk. So Laura spent about 2 decades working with organizations from across the environmental community, designing collaborative approaches to all kinds of issues that they face. I guess, Laura, you began as a conservation biologist and an international development practitioner, so maybe we'll learn about that one day too. So Laura has all these great firsthand experiences and knowledge about the power of collaboration, and loves to share that and guide people through that. And thinking about now the growth and sustainability of conservation partnerships by teaching collaborative leadership. So I think this is great that Laura, I've read several of her blogs. If you haven't, I encourage you to do so. And then maybe check out that book if you haven't already. So Laura, I so appreciate you taking the time today to do this. And I invite all of you to sit back as Laura first shares her thinking and her experiences in her career path, and then we'll dive into questions and conversation.
And so welcome. As Heather said, my name is Laura Calandrella, and I am talking to you today about facilitating collaborative groups. And I'm not just talking about facilitating any kind of collaborative group. I'm talking specifically about facilitating collaborations that focus on the challenges in our sustainability, in our conservation, and in our natural resource communities. And I love talking about this topic. I have been doing this work for about 20 years. And so there's been a wealth of experience that I've gained, successes, failures. And so it's really important for me to be able to share that knowledge with others. But at the same time, I'm getting to know just many of you right now. And so I'm not going to assume where you are in your evolution as a facilitator or in your evolution in participating in collaborative groups. So we're going to start really some basic things that you might roll your eyes at and go, Laura, why are we talking about this? But hopefully dive into some deeper learning. And it didn't go. All right, so the 3 topics that we are going to be covering today are first, career development, and I will use my journey as both in science as well as in sustainable development, and then also as a facilitator from the very first time that I facilitated a collaborative group all the way up until now. Then we'll talk about learning and evolving your practice as a facilitator, and we'll talk about the ways that we typically learn facilitation and some new ideas about how to think about learning facilitation. And then the third thing is we'll dive into lessons learned, and I'll offer 2 case studies that I have been involved in lately that will help to shed some light on learning that I'm sure many of you have seen in your own practices, but maybe also some new ideas there. And lastly, why am I the one that's talking to you about this? And Heather gave such a great introduction, and I really appreciate that. That's super kind. But the work that I do now is focused on establishing collaboratives and establishing partnerships that are achieving sustainability goals, conservation goals at landscape scale or larger. I do dip into other smaller projects, but really am focused now on how do we create transformational change in the world and do that in a way that really sticks to our conservation and sustainability values. So hopefully I can share some of that experience with you in a way that is meaningful. So given that I don't know where you all are starting from, I want to just define what is facilitation. What do we mean when we say facilitation? And you might already have a definition that is completely legit, but let's start with this definition so that we have shared language and a common understanding as we move through the topics today. So facilitation is engaging others towards a goal. I think that you probably all have in your minds, otherwise you wouldn't be here, some of the goals that you have worked with groups in achieving, but it can be even as simple as dinner tonight. So think about the idea of not eating dinner on your own, which I spend a lot of time eating dinner on my own, but let's say I wanted to go out and eat dinner with someone. You are going to have to engage others even towards the simplest of goals. And so that comes to the role of the facilitator. So what does the facilitator do? Now, I also just want to put a caveat in there, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. A facilitator is different than a convener. Usually those are not the two same roles, but in this case, in this instance of dinner, I'm both the facilitator and the convener. So I'm going to invite people into my space and say, hey, what do you want to eat? Where are we going? Do we cook at home? Do we go out? And engaging others in learning about what options are available. So knowledge, what do other people want? So relationships, and then what action do we take? And then as a facilitator, establishing the process that gets collaborative ideas and maybe new ideas. Maybe there's a new restaurant nobody's ever considered. And so that becomes the learning and the process that leads to that. So facilitation, facilitator. I also want to give you a little nugget that's my secret agenda for today. And that is that you are not just a facilitator, you are an artist. As a facilitator, you are someone who creates spaces for people to come into, to be vulnerable, to be listened to be heard, and to ultimately create something, again, that is bigger than themselves. And so you open that up in a way that is artistic. And it has to be not just the skills of facilitation, but that nuance, not just the how do we, or what do we do, but how do we do it? How do we get to that end result? So I hope you'll consider that. And maybe you're not all taking it on right now and saying, yes, I'm on board, but the idea of facilitation being a creative process. So before we begin, and this is something that I'd love for you to put in the chat box as well, is I have this phrase that attention follows intention. So what we pay attention to is based on what we intend. And so often when we're coming into a space and cultivating our own presence for coming into a space, we have to have really clear intention. So instead of asking the question, what do I want out of this? First, I want you to ask, what is your reason for being here? And then as a result of that reason for being here, what does that mean you want to be paying attention to? And then ultimately, what responsibility do you have for making that happen, either today or afterward? All right, so as you do that, I'm going to move forward because we have a little bit to get through. And I'm going to start with sharing the career development piece of this. How did I get to even be considered as a facilitator, consider myself as a facilitator? How did I integrate that learning? I started off as a scientist, and how has that transformed over time? This is a little bit of, this story will take a little bit of time just because I want you to be looking at where are there parallels or where are there differences in your own journey, and hopefully be able to tease those apart for our discussion later. So I started working on collaborative initiatives in 1999, and I was just out of my first year of university where I was studying both biology and Spanish. As a result, that first year I had a research project and I was in Mexico City and then also in the transvolcanic belt that surrounded it. And that's where you see me here on the right with a lovely haircut that has since grown, as I hope you can see in the previous video. And hopefully my facilitation skills have grown as well. But this was the inception of it all. This was the moment. So as a biologist, I intended to go into that project, or I thought I was going into that project focused on biology. And the professor that I was working with at Arizona State connected me with researchers down in Mexico City to focus on the conservation of this little rabbit. Isn't he adorable? His name is Zacatuche, and he's called the volcano rabbit. He lives in the transvolcanic belt. He is endangered and also endemic to the area, and also a keystone species. So his health and survival represents the health and survival of the entire ecosystem. What I didn't know is that to focus on the conservation of this animal and its habitat, we were going to have to involve a whole bunch of players. And so earlier when I said the difference between conveners and facilitators, that those are two different roles, there were conveners of this project that were saying, hey, there is an issue that we need to focus on. We don't know exactly what the solutions are, and we maybe don't even know exactly what the goal is, but we know that we all have a pretty strong role to play in making this happen. So the goal being conservation of the habitat. That was sort of the focus. And so CEMEX was one of those conveners, and they are a global leader in the building materials industry, and they have a pretty strong focus on sustainability. Conservation International, which is a nonprofit that has really been known for years and years and years for their blend of science, but also really focusing on the human issues. And then UNAM, which is a Mexican university that my professor in Arizona was connected with. And the person on the left is one of those researchers that I was working with. Then the person on the right was one of the community leaders that we were also engaged with. So there was a fourth stakeholder, and that was the community of San Nicolas Totolapan. Now, San Nicolas had a really big role to play, and there was a reason for focusing on this community as opposed to any other area in the Transvolcanic Belt. And that was because they were the last communally owned land inside of the official district of Mexico City. So that was a pretty big deal. Urban development, Mexico City was the largest city in the world at the time, 20 million people or more. And this land was at huge threat for development. So the community was really at a choice point. The choices were sell the land for a profit or find some other sustainable way, economically sustainable, as well as culturally sustainable way to maintain the character of their land. And in bringing this group together, the representatives from the community, CEMEX, CI, and UNAM, bringing them together was the initial conversation about what do we do? Remembering in the back of your mind that there is a goal of conserving habitat. Although the focus was the species itself, the endangered species itself, the goal was conserving habitat and doing that in a way that supported the community. So boiling all of that down, after several years of having collaborative conversations, the community landed on an ecotourism park. The community had reimagined what their land was for and started to build sustainably opportunities for camping and hiking and recreation. You see mountain biking here and fishing. And there was this need for that from Mexico City, from the urban residents of Mexico City. It was the closest place that they could go to breathe in nature, to recreate in nature. Also, there's these added benefits of this particular place protected the water, a major watershed for Mexico City. So clean air and clean water was something that urban residents were also suffering from. So behind the scenes in all of this, I thought I was going there to really focus on community-based conservation and the science behind that. And I got thrown into the role of actually facilitating those conversations. Now, I'm not sure what was in anybody's mind when they did this to a 19-year-old kid, but they did it, and I got thrown into the fire. And, you know, remembering too that Spanish is not my first language. And I was pretty fluent in it, but like I said, there's an art to facilitation, and there's nuance to the conversations that we have when we're facilitating. So a whole bunch of challenges that somehow, well supported by people who believed in me, ended up in a really good spot. What happened after this, after I left the project, was that across the Transvolcanic Belt and in adjacent communities, there was a replication of ecotourism so that other communities wouldn't have to sell their lands. And it started to create this networked ecosystem of conservation habitat. Now, I'm sorry to say that in 2018, the last Acatuche was seen in the wild. And so we think it's extinct. Yet at the same time, that doesn't mean that there's not a host of other benefits that were provided by this facilitated conversation, this collaborative group coming together. So that was the journey, the initial journey. Then after that, I got really fired up, and having even no idea that facilitation was a thing or that was what I was doing, I'm like, I can do this. I'm going to start traveling the world. So wrote a grant to work on community-based conservation and just intuitively focusing on that role that I had played in Mexico. So I jumped from Mexico to Guatemala, to Ecuador, to Brazil, over to Kenya, to Thailand, and then to New Zealand before I would finally land back in the United States. All of those times, again, not knowing that I was doing facilitation, but providing a very similar role and helping groups engage in a process that moved towards a goal. So back in Atlanta, which is where I am now, I got a job with the US Forest Service that covered the region, the Southeast region of the United States. When I was first brought into the Forest Service, again, here's somebody telling me, you can do it. You can facilitate these conversations. Remembering I'm 26 years old at this point. So the senior executive of this region of the Forest Service, probably, I don't know, less than a month after I got into my job, called me into his office and he said, hey, Laura, you seem to have experience with facilitation. How about you facilitate the regional strategic plan? And I, in my head, am thinking to myself, what is facilitation? Wait, what is he asking me to do? But I, in my precociousness and readiness, said absolutely, and then ran back to my desk to try to figure out, how does one do a strategic plan? What was the previous strategic plan? And really, what the heck is facilitation? So over the course of 10 years, I would learn a lot of lessons. I would work across the Southeast and then eventually nationally with the Forest Service, which, for those of you that don't know, the Forest Service has a really rich history of being embedded in communities and having to work across multiple perspectives. It's a little bit different than the National Park Service. Not that the National Park Service doesn't have to do that too, but especially in the Southeast, there's so much private land ownership that national forests are really embedded in communities, and there's a need to resolve issues very, very locally. So worked on a range of issues and learned at some point, facilitation is actually a thing. Oh, this is a role that people play. And at that point, asked for training. Please, dear God, somebody train me in how to do this, because I'd been flying by the seat of my pants and I knew that there were ways that I could help groups to engage better. I knew that there were processes to learn. You guys said some of it earlier, learning to listen, learning to engage early in planning. All of that was coming to me, but I needed structured ways of thinking about it and growing. And then, of course, practice after practice after practice just sort of grew in who I was as a facilitator. But ultimately, and kind of where I am today, like I said, I have my own consulting practice that doesn't just focus on facilitation. Facilitation is a vehicle to get to collaborative conservation. But in the end, when people ask me, how did you get to where you are? Or how do I learn facilitation? Or how does facilitation apply in a collaborative setting? There's basically 4 things that I point them to. Okay, you're going to learn it through workshops or training. You're going to learn it through shadowing or co-facilitating with other people. You're going to learn by being a participant and watching what others do, but also going, oh, I could do that, or I would do it differently, or facilitating on the fly. And I think you could probably see in my journey how all of those were present. And I go back to this idea of being an artist. There's no one way. You could be a painter, you could be a pianist. You're still an artist, and your tools might be different, but you're still creating something beautiful for the world and something new for the world. So here's sort of, oops, nope, not that one. Here's sort of the framework that I've boiled it all down to, and all of the learning that I've done is that when we are facilitating and when we are asking groups to come into a collaborative space, there are really 3 things that are most important. And it's creating the space for knowledge, so what's happening in our head, creating the space for heart, so how do we engage one another on a person-to-person level, and then hands, how do we actually get to something that's tangible? My experience has been that when collaborative groups come together, the first thing that they want to do is jump to action. And yet what I know from years of doing this is that if you don't focus on heart, in my opinion, heart first, and also head, you have to build knowledge around what the problem actually is, then hands doesn't matter. You'll get to the wrong action. You might get to it quickly, but you'll get to the wrong action. And so it's a balance of this. When I boil down all of the training and learning that I've done, and every time I go into a facilitated engagement, when I plan for a facilitated engagement, I'm thinking about outcomes in each one of these categories. And so if one of your questions is, what kind of training do I need? Part of me wants to say, what kind of training excites you? And what domain of collaboration does this fit into? Yes, you will need processes, and that's probably more of the hands. How do you get to action and strategy? You'll need to learn empathy and listening skills. And for me, a lot of that came through becoming a certified coach. So I went through that and then learned adult development. And then here's another really important part is head. I am hired more often than not because my background is in conservation, is in sustainability, is in international development. So there's a real role for you all to play, no matter what your content field is, in bringing that, because it helps you to surface what are the mindsets that are common in this community and what knowledge needs to be built across these communities. So we're all on a learning journey. There's no one right path. And I wonder if Heather was hoping that I would give you the exact detail about how do you get from A to Z. And unfortunately, no, there is no way. So we're coming from ground zero and just becoming aware, like I was in Mexico in those projects. Afterwards, I'm unconsciously incompetent, right? I don't know what I don't know. As I start to become aware of what I'm doing, I realize I need skills and tools and go ask for that training or co-facilitate with someone. And so I realize that consciously I'm incompetent at doing this. But once I start to develop those tools and practices, then I start to focus on expanding my learning and becoming more as a facilitator. But I'm still a little bit, and even still today, guys, still a little bit, I'm realizing I'm running late, so I'm gonna move through this. Still learning, and then finally, the artistry of it is cultivating your craft and really stepping into it on your own. So art is not what you see, but what you make others see. I would say art is not what you see, but what you help others to discover. All right, so I'm gonna run through these two really quickly. So this project, Heather and I talked about finding a project that really represented some of the environmental justice issues. And I happened to be on this particular project in 2016. And the conveners that were coming together, the stakeholders that were coming together were vastly different. There were two nonprofits that were local in Atlanta that really focused on underserved communities and finding career pathways or serving an urban watershed. There was a federal government, there was the conservation fund, which acquires land. They all were coming in and they had a ton of different reasons to be there and they wanted to work with one another. They just didn't know what the goal was. We just know that we can do something good, which was a huge challenge. And a lot of it was about wrestling through what those perspectives were and what they wanted to do and what the relationships even were. And then what happened over time. So the challenge for me, not the challenge of the particular project, was that I came in, even being completely aware of cultural context, and implemented a process called empathy mapping that immediately threw all of the participants into a space of fear, as though I was asking them to stereotype their communities. Empathy mapping is also centered around getting into the hearts and minds of the people that you're serving. And I thought, since there wasn't a defined problem, or sorry, a defined reason to collaborate, that would help to surface what are those key leverage points or key points of intersection that people, that they could really serve. I had to take a big step back in that meeting and say, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I am wrong. Let me hear from you, and find not just a new process, but rebuild trust between myself and them, as well as one another. The ultimate result of this is that the creation of the Browns Mill Food Forest, which is the largest free food forest in the United States. And it serves an area of Atlanta where 1 in 3 people are below the poverty line. And it takes more than 30 minutes for people to get to a grocery store by bus. So ultimately, what are the lessons learned? cultural context matters. Even if you think you understand the cultural context, I'd been living in Atlanta for 11 years, was aware of the issues. I knew cultural context matters, but really stepping back and engaging in even more empathy within yourself and being aware of the spaces that you're entering into. Similarly, empathy mapping had worked for me many, many times. Not every process will work every time. Engaging the convener early. I got hired for this project a week before they were actually having their first meeting. I didn't have a lot of time to engage the convener. I only knew 2 of the stakeholders, so I made a lot of assumptions going into that. What I probably should have done was say, you know what? Can we postpone? Can we move this meeting to a further date so that we're coming in to this very first meeting, this very important topic, ready and prepared? And then finally, it's okay to make mistakes. Thank God they forgave me and didn't throw me out of the room. There was a moment of panic where I was like, I think I'm done for. But it's okay to make mistakes. And part of the skill of being a facilitator is not being able to step away from your emotion and see what's going on, look in from the outside and say, what is it that I need to do? A level of emotional intelligence. So the second project that I will talk to you about is one that I'm still engaged in, and it's one of the most exciting projects that I am engaged in. It's called Keeping Forests, and it started in 2016 as well. So I've been working on this project for 5 years now. And when I was brought in, it was really five conveners from different stakeholders, mostly government. There was like 1 or 2 nonprofit, or 1 nonprofit and then 1 for-profit company that were brought in. The problem that they were wanting to solve was this loss of southern forests. So 23 million acres will be lost by 2060, which if you're into water, that means, that's a huge degradation of water in the watersheds in the South. And it was all happening because of urbanization and population increase. The Southeast is one of the most rapidly increasing parts of the United States. It also has the extra challenge that it's not in federal or state conservation. It's 86% of it is owned by private landowners. So this is a huge challenge to wrestle with. It's a regional challenge, and I could drag you through the last 5 years, but I think the important thing for you to know here is they didn't know how, were they just going to be making sure that people that were connected to this issue were in conversation or coordinating their efforts. And what became very clear is that we needed everyone, all hands on deck, to try to solve this challenge in front of us. It is now a partnership of 40 or more partners, everyone from CEOs of Fortune 500 companies to high wealth investment funds to minority nonprofits that focus on minority land ownership, to TNC, to federal and state government. I mean, you name it, there is everyone at the table. And one of the things that was really, really challenging was to keep that group together. So the fact that it's still in existence and doing some rocking things right now. There's a podcast that we have out called How the River Flows. If you want to go out and check that out, that's kind of interesting. But it really took a lot to focus on keeping people engaged. And so I'll give you the lessons learned there. Transformational change requires transformational thinking. Going back to that idea that everyone wants to get to action, these are senior executives. They don't have a lot of time on their hands, but they also didn't know one another and didn't know what one another's agenda was. And so there was a lot of work that I had to do as a facilitator to build relationship, to get them to trust one another, to even get them to define the problem and not try to zero in so quickly on this is a problem so that we can solve it. And it was teaching them a new way of thinking and interacting with one another. At the same time, as I'm pulling them back, I also know that they have to have momentum. They have to see some sort of result. So being very clear from year to year, what is the milestone for this year? And making sure that we were driving toward it. The first year was defining the goal. The second year was mapping out the values on the landscape to help us understand where we might want to work. Are we working at a more fine point, or are we working at a landscape scale? Identifying that the center of our solutions the next year was focusing on private landowners, and we're finally into the stage of implementation. And those 40 partners have hung together throughout this, and I'm really excited to see what it's going to contribute to recently the Biden's 30 by 30 initiative, which focuses on 30% of the land by 2030, conserving 30% of the land by 2030. So next lesson is that facilitators shouldn't always be neutral. I would not have survived or been, would have been, what is the word I'm searching for? Would have been credible within this community had I not had the background that I had, not only as a facilitator, not only understanding collaboration, but the fact that I could at certain points and take off my facilitator hat and offer content expertise or perspective because of my background. That could move the group forward. And I think we always need to be looking for, we're not just supposed to stay objective all the time as facilitators. And it's not only content knowledge, we're allowed to insert ourselves into conversations when it's appropriate. And then lastly, and I said this earlier, relationship matters above all else. If this project fails tomorrow, it will not be a failure. There have been networks that have been created, side projects that have been created, new collaborations that have been created. This collaboration and the partners in it are connecting with others at a scale that kind of blows my mind, even working towards some sustainable development goals. And so no matter what we did, if this falls apart tomorrow, I will be really proud of this project as part of my portfolio of experience. So boiling it down, what does facilitation look like? Well, oftentimes it looks like this, which is, you know, in meeting rooms, in front of a room, waving your hands about, bringing people together and trying to get them through the process that's in front of them. But I always remember that when I'm facilitating, it is more about these experiences and places and people and goals that values that I really resonate with that will ultimately move us forward. So in a room, I keep this in the back of my mind. With that, I will just say a couple of things. Heather mentioned she'll give you the slides. You can also text collaborate to this number and I'll drop it in the chat so that you have it. And that will automatically send you the slides so you don't have to wait for them. They will come today. You'll also be subscribed to my newsletter list. Heather also mentioned so beautifully, thank you, that my book takes some of these practices deeper and thinks about it not only as a facilitator, but what is our role as leaders in transforming what we're doing and thinking about things at scale. And then lastly, I'll come back to where we started, which is as you move forward, what is your intention for this work? What do you need to be paying attention to? And what is your responsibility in getting there? So with that, I'm going to get back on camera and hopefully we have enough time for questions and stop my share. So questions, what are you guys, going back to intention, attention, responsibility, I invite you to ask any of those questions, answer any of those questions or other things that sparked along the way. I'm looking over here because this is where you are, but I'll look at you when.
Laura, thank you. This is Greg Newman. I'm fascinated by this conversation. Thank you so much for the expertise and recommendations and guidance. I'm curious about how facilitation has changed. I'm sure you've been asked this probably 1,000 times over given COVID. And in this age we find ourselves, we're trying to connect with people online. And at the end, you showed the traditional facilitation model, waving hands and moving around, and we all know and love that environment. But I wonder if you could speak briefly to how, the practice has changed and evolved given the online nature of reaching distributed people.
Yeah, absolutely. I did virtual facilitation before COVID. And so there were pieces, because people are so distributed and the ease of getting together, that I was already doing, but I'm noticing So I don't know if you were here at the beginning, I'm actually standing right now. And so just for me to be up, I'm hoping, this is the first time I've done it this way. So I'm hoping that that brings a different energy to the group. It certainly brings a different energy to me. So the best that you can create your space. What is the space around you that serves you as a guide and a vehicle for others? I also am a big fan of bringing graphic facilitation in. In fact, Heather, I hired Carrie from the Confluence Network the other week to participate because it does help people ground in. And I think that there's sort of arcs of facilitation over time. So how do we create kind of mini sprints? Can you split out the head, heart, and hands and really be intentional about what each space or what each time together is for? I actually invite everybody in the chat to share your own lessons learned because I'm still learning. I can tell you that this feels a lot better, even though the computer is over here and it's a little awkward doing this for the first time. So I'm not looking at you. There's a way that I'm connecting with you because I'm having to be really present to what's here, right? And I can look at you over here as well.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Deb says becoming a professional coach was possibly the best thing I could have done to deepen my facilitation practice. Absolutely. All of those things around powerful questions and navigating people's emotional space and learning to understand what the bigger vision and agenda for any person or group coming together is. All of those skills definitely improved me as a facilitator. I'm actually taking a course this weekend on organizational and relation systems coaching. It's a course called ORSC, and I think that's going to be really, really powerful in the facilitation space as well. I sort of think of myself as a systems facilitator. How do I navigate a system? And my coach training I did through, it's now called Coactive. It used to be called CTI, Coach Training Institute, but it's the I'll provide it as a resource and follow up. I'll ask Heather to do that. And Deb says she went to Newfield in Boulder. And I speak to this in the book. The best thing that you can actually do as a facilitator is your own personal development and growth, and really knowing who you are, so that you can offer that fully to others and model it fully to others. Because really at the end of the day, it's human relationships are hard, but we need those relationships to be able to think together and to act together. Yeah, John, go ahead.
Awesome. Thanks, Laura. First of all, that was really, really awesome. I appreciate you taking the time to do this. So kind of going back to what you touched on a minute ago, and you'd said this earlier, is that these are pretty challenging conversations at times that we're involved with, and emotionally charged, or I deal with fire. That's been a tough one for people here in Oregon and across the West, obviously. How do we help to acknowledge those challenges without, also creating that bring up the trauma back in the forefront conversation piece and some other things? Do you have any thoughts on how you kind of pepper in there to be sensitive, but not make it so pointed that it's maybe bringing someone back, because we want to keep them engaged, as you indicated. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if I can clarify my crazy question to you at all.
Sure, and so keep yourself off mute, because I want to talk to you a little bit. Are you specifically talking about wildfires?
Well, sure, for my particular job, but I've been involved with other conversations in other topics, but yes.
Yeah, there's a difference between bringing up old trauma and acknowledging old trauma, right? I think that there's a space for it, especially at the beginning of any collaboration, to honor the history. Sometimes what I do when I'm bringing new groups, especially diverse groups or groups that might be in conflict, is I'll create like a timeline. So, but I won't create the timeline. They will create the timeline. So putting a big, just a big sheet of paper on the wall. And again, here's a great place where a graphic facilitator could come in, or using whiteboards or Jamboards, to have them Okay, so here's sort of the start of our history or of this issue together. Here's where we are today. How can I contribute? What is your individual story or your organization story around that? And so what you start to see is that people there, I mean, all of that trauma is story. So surfacing that, acknowledging that, and not letting it be something that you don't acknowledge so that it's always hanging in the background. It's really about building common understanding. And that then leads to the ability to define the challenge that's actually in front of you so that you're not constantly getting dragged back.
That's awesome. I really appreciate that thought. I think that how we connect them and keep them engaged, that's exactly what I was kind of looking for. So that's a really cool exercise. And it's always, everything's challenging without the being there, but cool. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask a question. Hi, Laura. Nice to meet you finally, virtually.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll just say, so I'm actually in Nova Scotia, Canada. Hello, everyone. I'm a climate adaptation coordinator with the provincial government here. So we have a climate adaptation leadership program that I'm delivering to Provincial Department of Lands and Forestry in Nova Scotia, as well with an external team that's going to be focusing on coastal parks. So what our goal is to collaborate on producing a shared adaptation strategy for coastal parks in Nova Scotia. So it's not something that's going to just, be under provincial government's responsibility. It's going to have shared ownership so that we can, sustain its implementation and accountability. So what I'm working on right now is just putting a team together. So I'm just curious, like, what's your experience with, or if you do have experience with actually putting a team together, knowing what your outcome is going to be. So how can I best, ensure that I'm, hitting that diversity mark, hitting that inclusion mark and stuff like that. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that stuff.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that government often is the convener and really wants to hand that off at some point, right? So I think with the particular issue that you're wrestling with is who are the communities, who are the entities, the stakeholders that would want to take this on and would benefit from taking this on. Government stays though for a really long time, and that's a piece of their role is to initiate and to get things going. But if I were thinking about how to put that together, I would almost do kind of a network map, either with you or with whoever it is that you already have engaged, and just kind of find those points of synergy. One of the things that I find really challenging when I'm working with whoever the sponsor is of programs, or even within collaborations, when we say the right voices aren't at the table, is like this lack of creativity and like, I don't know where to go. It's like, so in my mind, and this is maybe my Zennial, it's like, why don't you go on your LinkedIn, like go on Finds, like dig, go see who's out there doing cool things. And so I think there's a research component to it, and it takes a lot of work and exploration, but it can be a creative exercise. But yeah, I think bottom line is who's going to own this in the end, and who do you need to engage from the beginning?
Totally. No, for sure. Yeah, I want to make sure. Yeah, no, that's great. And I think I'm struggling with, I don't want it to be the same people all the time. And I really want to make sure, those different voices that value these coastal parks are at the table too. So like lifeguard service, all that kind of stuff, the surfing association, because there's a ton of surfing out here. So I want to make sure like those people that, receive like these benefits and values from the parks are also at the table talking about climate adaptation.
Yep. Sounds like you know where to start.
I'm trying my best.
Yeah.
All thanks to your book.
Oh, yeah. Heather, I know we're running out of time and I see your hand up, so I'll hand it back over.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that one of the most fun exercises we ever did in our watershed was a collaborative stakeholder mapping exercise. Have all kinds of people throw their mind together to say, well, who is out there? Who do you know? And then figure out those linkages. And that's really quite fun. We probably have time for one more quick question here.
I'd like to say just a word, if I may, Heather. First,
Yeah.
Laura, I'll share with you my favorite technique for my favorite virtual facilitating little trick. So I just reached up here to the top of my screen where I have a Logitech camera. And right below the camera, I have this. And I put that there because I know that when I'm looking at my little happy face, then I appear to be looking in the eyes of the people who are on the screen. So to your point earlier about the computer off to the side and so on, because
So
I think
just
it's really interesting.
see this contraption that we have going on over here. It's like, it's a deal.
Fabulous. But that's just a little minor technique that I love how you didn't really focus so much on the techniques, but you focused so much on heart and relationship and intention. And the techniques are super important, but so often in this dialogue about how do we facilitate, we really focus on techniques, we really focus on action. And I love how you put so much emphasis on relationships and caring and people and where we ourselves are coming from. And I can see that you're continuously investing in yourself, which is also a value that I share. And I just want to say I really appreciated hearing that perspective from you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm putting together a facilitation course for later this year, and I'm struggling because there are so many places. In fact, I probably need to do a resource list. Here's all the trainings that I've taken, and it's why I said when you look at head, heart, and hands, there are resources and tools and trainings for each of those. But you know, many people can teach you facilitation techniques. I'm interested in what's happening behind the scenes that can lead you to that artistry of facilitation.
Well, this has been a great conversation, and I loved your willingness, Laura, to share so much thinking through your career pathway with all of us and the projects that you've worked on. So thank you for being so willing to do that. And I hope you all enjoyed this as well, and that it's triggered all kinds of ideas and thinking for you.